Oh, thank you, Julie. What a perfectly beautiful introduction and a generous one. Thank you very much. And it's lovely to be back in Atlanta. We were here 2 years ago, and it's such a beautiful city. I certainly don't have to sell it to any one of you. And, of course, Gone with the Wind. My God, I love that book. I reread it every 10 years or so. I can quote from it. And it was the most wonderful story, as you all know. And I thought, boy, if I could write anything like that. Well, I don't like anything like that, but I hope I tell a tale that you enjoy. So I'm glad to be back.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to be here, too. That was hard to believe that was 2 years ago we were here. And it's great fun to travel with my mother, to be on book tour with her and talk about our books and our new books now. As Julie said, I got started by retyping her books way back when and giving her my 2 cents about what was going on in them. And as far as that loves music, loves to dance story, the other thing was the girl was trying to figure out who killed her friend through the personal ads in New York City, and my mother had a guy invite the girl to Rumpelmeyer's for brunch, which is where you bring little kids for ice cream sundaes. And I was typing it, and I called my mother, I said, Mom, if a guy invited you to Rumpelmeyer's, he'd be worse than a serial killer. So that's when I changed all the bars in the book, and that was kind of fun. But it was a great experience for me to retype her books and see the process and retype them along the way and ask her, what are you going to do next? Because they weren't always finished when I was retyping, and that was great for me in learning how to be a writer myself.
Well, you know, one of the first questions people ask are, when did you decide to be a writer? I never decided. It was decided for me, because from the time I could hold a pen and put words together, I was writing short stories. I was writing skits and making my brothers perform in them. I remember my little brother said once, "Can I just once be the star?" I said, "No, I wrote it. That makes me the star." Well, fortunately, I had a mother who praised and praised, because I warn teachers and parents and grandparents, if a child offers you something creative, don't say you misspelled or your writing is sloppy. Look at what they're offering you. They're offering you the budding of a talent. And unless you encourage and encourage, you might discourage. You might have them say, oh, that was silly, or that doesn't make sense. Say that to them, and you might put out a talent, put out someone who really had something to offer. But I would recite my new poem. My mother was one of 5 sisters, and when the girls came over, it was, Mary has written a beautiful new poem. Mary, stand on the landing and recite your beautiful new poem. Well, I'm sure they were ready to strangle me. But then when I finished with it, Mother led the applause. Isn't that wonderful? Mary's going to grow up to be a wonderful writer. Well, you know, that encouragement is absolutely marvelous, because when you do grow up, and when you start submitting short stories, as I did to the women's magazines back in the early 1950s, I had 11 short stories out before I sold the first one for $100. The first one that I sold, Stowaway, was out 40 times before a little magazine in Chicago bought it. And by then I had 11 short stories in the mail. And I was sure I was going to sell. I was absolutely sure. I had gone and taken a writing class. I had been a Pan American flight hostess, which was very, very glamorous, 1950. I don't mind giving away my age. I'm getting venerable. But I flew for a year, saw Europe, Africa, and Asia, and then got married and said, I have to learn how to be a professional writer. And I walked down to New York University. We lived very near it, and signed up for a short story course. And I learned everything I ever needed to know about writing in that course, because the professor said, write about what you know. And he pointed to me. He said, Mary, you've been a Pan American flight hostess. The magazines are getting stories from the captain's viewpoint, not from the stewardess. He said, take the most dramatic incident that occurred when you were a flight hostess. Ask yourself 2 questions, suppose and what if, and then turn that incident into fiction. I have added one more question, which is why. Because in suspense, if 4 people have the opportunity, the motive, and the circumstances to commit a major crime, only one of them would have committed the crime, would have gone over the edge and taken a life or a series of lives, been vengeful enough, psychotic enough. But there will be 4 others who might have done it, or 3 others who might have done it. But that was the way I started. I sent out that first short story. When I turned it into the professor, he said, Mary has written a professional story. It is going to sell. I promise her it is going to sell. Well, that's what I say. 6 years and 40 rejection slips later, it did sell. And I have that letter framed, $100 for it, and I thought I had died and gone to heaven. Because I got the envelope instead of my self-addressed stamped envelope with my manuscript in it. And when I took it out of the mailbox, we had just moved out to northern New Jersey, and it was very, very, more than suburban. It was almost like farmland in those days. And I propped it against the sugar bowl, and I had a couple of cups of tea. And I thought, is it possible I'm sold? And I wanted to wonder, before I opened it, and that maybe they wanted me to take a subscription to the magazine. And that was the beginning of selling, and the beginning of what has turned out to be a very happy, happy career, because the best thing in the world is to love what you do. Now, Carol, why don't you tell a bit about...
Oh, yes. People ask where you get your ideas. I mean, I had come up with Regan Reillys, who's a private investigator, and a publisher was interested, and they're the ones who said to me, make her mother a mystery writer. And I said, oh, okay. And I thought, okay, what should her father do? And I thought, at the time my father died, there were 2 funeral parlors in town, and one was new and struggling, and the other was successful. And he had gone to a wake with my mother at the successful home, and he knew he was dying. He had a bad heart. It was before the bypass. He would have lived if he had lived a couple more years before when they started doing the bypass. But anyway, when he died, my grandmother died the same night because she had a heart attack when she realized he was dying. So my mother brought them to the struggling funeral home in town, and everybody in town came. It was a small town, and my father knew a lot of people. And after that, this funeral director's struggling business started to flourish. So when he'd see my mother, he'd come running up to her and say, Mary, how can I ever thank you? Your grief was the turning point in my career. So he turned out to be a real character, and he was always thanking her, and she said, anything I can do for a friend, you know. So one time we were out to dinner and on a snowy New Year's Day, and the other people in the restaurant were this man and his family. So we waved and said, we all feel fine, thank you. And then the maitre d' said he'd like to buy us a round of drinks. So my brother said, make mine a stiff one, you know, put mine on ice, the whole thing. Well, anyway, I made Regan's father a funeral director in New Jersey. And so now I hear everybody's funeral parlor stories. But that was my basis, Regan, a private investigator. These are her parents. And then she met Jack, who is the head of the major case squad. In the first book my mother and I wrote together, Deck the Halls, where Regan's father is kidnapped. And I kept going with that. But several years back, I got a letter from a guy who wanted to be my butler. And he said he could live in or out, $50,000 a year. You know, at the time, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in New York City. And who wouldn't love to have a butler? And he said all the humble things a servant should do, but he enclosed an article about the butler school he had gone to. And I thought, oh, this might be interesting. But at the time, my mother was getting married to my stepfather, and there was an article in People magazine. And it said she's marrying John Conheeney from Ridgewood, New Jersey. So this guy called information, and he got my stepbrother's house, John Jr. And he said, you know, I wrote to her about being a butler. What about that butler job? And they said, okay, we'll give her the message. And like 2 days later, he called, what about that butler job? So he turned out to be a little, you know, wacky, which is good for a writer. And I thought I'd use a butler school in a book. So then I was over in London, and I called the guy who had the most famous butler school and asked if I could pay to audit some classes I wanted to use the background in a book. And he started screaming at me and said, no, you can't. People try and copy my ideas all the time, and they always fail, and blah, blah, blah. And he hung up on me. So that's when I took my mother's first piece of advice about writing, which is, if someone's mean to you, make them a victim in your next book. Everybody thinks she's so nice, but she gets it all out on paper, you know, so.
Well, that's absolutely true, because, you know, you never have to be vengeful. You just say, how can I murder him? And, you know, people ask, do you use people you know in your books? Well, of course. I mean, I have looked and said, who is the face of the girl, the woman in my next book? And I was in France once because I sell very well in France, and I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know why the French have been so really kind to me. I've been their #1 best-selling author for over 30 years, and I don't use French women in it. But the French have a very strong sense of values, and my books are family-oriented. You know, people are not looking for trouble. For example, if you read that a young girl was found and she had been killed, and then you read that she had been wearing a see-through blouse and a miniskirt, 4 in the morning in the worst part of town, you would say, that's awful, but what in the name of God was she doing there? My daughter would not be there, or my granddaughter would not be there. On the other hand, if you read that a woman was home and looked at her watch and said, good God, I've got to pick up the baby from mother, it's getting late. And she goes out and gets in her car and gets to the end of the driveway, and a voice from the floor of the back seat says, don't turn right, dear, turn left. That's your daughter, that's that sweet girl down the block. So I use people who are not looking for trouble. Trouble comes in on them. And the way they handle it, the way they see their way through it, is what the book is all about. And I think that the French have really appreciated the fact that I write like that. And why did I start talking about the French? There must have been a good reason. Well, anyhow. I know, because my publisher in France some years ago, I was trying to find the face of the woman in the story I was writing. I think it's Moonlight Becomes You. And Olivia de Havilland's daughter is a journalist, Giselle Gallant. She's a beautiful girl. And we were at this dinner for luncheon at his wonderful home for journalists, and I just looked across and I said, Giselle, you're Molly. Thank you very much. Because her description was what I was looking for, that beautiful heart-shaped face, those enormous eyes. I was looking for that person, and that has happened to me in others where I just see and I said, that's what he looks like, or that's what she looks like. I will go back to the 8th grade and remember a kid I went to school with and say, he looks like Rudy. You know, he's tall and blonde and he had that nice smile. I can find people, and of course I never would in any way embarrass anyone, except that only once, my friend's husband was very nice, but he was very stuffy. They're both gone now. But he would let you know his lineage, you know, the clubs the family belonged to, the whole family went to Harvard, who didn't go to Yale. You know, you got the whole treatment the first time you met him. Everybody did. And I had a character in the book, Stillwatch. And when I sort of based it a bit on him. And when I get the first copy of my book, I open it and read it as a reader, not as an author who's looking, maybe there's a better word for this, or let's move that sentence. I read it as a reader. And when I got to the part about this character, I looked. I said, my God, he leaped off the pages. No one could miss him. No one in the whole world. And about 10 days later, his wife called me up. And she said, Mary, we have read your new book. I said, yes. She said, that character, and I almost sweat blood, I really did. And she said, John and I know so many people just like him. I said, thanks be to God and his blessed mother. No more, Lord, will I ever come that close to the bone. I promise, I promise, I promise. But you do look around. You listen for what things people say. I mean, the kids used to say to me when they were growing up, and I say, she's on the Erie again. You know, you'd be hearing a conversation at the next table. It was pretty fascinating. Well, actually, after school, I was a scholarship in high school, Villa Maria Academy, a lovely, lovely school. And I would go after school and work at the Hotel Shelton from 4 until 7, 3 days a week and weekends. And those were those old switchboards, Hotel Shelton, good afternoon. And there was a lady of the evening, and I just loved to listen to her. Because you see, when those switchboards, if you pull out the master plug, and then you can open the other plug, and it doesn't click, it goes very softly. And I would have a good time, listening in on people when the board was slow. And one time she said, "Don't say another word, that damn operator is listening in." And I said, "I am not." And I yanked the connection down, and a minute later, the chief operator, "Who was in on Maggie Ryan? Who had Maggie Ryan? Hotel Shelton." So everything is grist for the mill. The people you see, the people you hear, the people you knew, the people you hear about. And they belong in your story. And in the story, they'll belong in one of the stories, perhaps. And the interesting thing is that the hardest part about writing is the first 50 pages. I rewrite and I rewrite and I rewrite and I rewrite those first 50 pages. It's to get into it. Who are the characters? I do biographies of the characters. I know, because if you're one of 5, or if you're an only child, you're different. You're not better, but you're different. You may be more self-reliant as an only child. You had to entertain yourself. So you've got to know who they are. Does she dress in a sweater set, more conservatively, or is she frilly? Who is she? Because that's part of how the character looks. It says something about the way they are. Are they a lot of fun and lighthearted, or are they someone who is serious and contemplative? All of that has to go into the forming of a character. But then after 50 pages, if the characters are grounded, they come alive. I don't drag them down the block. I chase them down the block. I say, "Wait a minute, stay in this scene. You're supposed to be in this." And I hear the guy say, "Sorry, Mary, I'm out of here. Give that line to her. It's not my line, girl." That's when writing is fun.
My mother cracks me up sometimes. I had an answering machine years ago, and still do, but this particular one I had. And one night, I took a shower, came out, and I went over to my machine, and the wheels were turning. Someone had called in and pressed in my code. And I live alone, and I picked it up and hung it up, and they called back and pressed in my code, and I picked it up and hung it up. This happened several times. And so it was late at night and dark, and I'm by myself, and I called my mother, and I relayed all this to her, and there was a pause, and she said, "What a wonderful plot." And I said, "Oh, thank you for being worried about me, Mom." But anyway, with my latest book, Zapped, it's set during a blackout in New York City, and I was there in August of 2003 during the blackout, and I went to a friend's apartment. I drove uptown, and it was a lot of it was fun, as long as it doesn't last too long. And I thought I would want to use that in a book. And I had also I had bought an apartment about 4.5 years ago and spent a year renovating it. And then a year and a half ago, I live in the building that the plane crashed into in New York City. Remember the poor baseball player, Corey Lytle. So I had a lot of damage to my apartment, and thank God no one in my building was killed, and those poor 2 men were. But I spent another year on renovation, so I thought I would never use something like the plane crash. That was a tragedy, and my books deal with humor. But certainly the renovation process that I went through again so quickly, and all that entails, anyone who has been through it. So I thought I'd use that in the book as well. And I started doing research into contractors, and how many of them, they say the contractor's ultimate fantasy is to renovate an old home or apartment. They're new owners, and to find some hidden treasure in the walls or under the floorboards, money, jewelry. Some of them might give it to the owners, some won't. But it was so interesting on the internet, because I think one man in Ohio ripped out a medicine cabinet and found a lot of old cash. And he was doing the job for a woman he knew from high school, and he called her up and was so excited, and she barely gave him anything, and now he's suing her, of course. But, she wasn't really very fair, because he didn't he should have told her about it, but he didn't have to if he wanted to be dishonest. And then I always get so interested. There was a woman in New York who found a painting in the trash, walking down the street, and she she took it home and she could tell it was valuable. So she spent a long time trying to trace it. And it turned out it was worth $1 million. And she got it back to the owners, and she didn't get much thanks either. So anyway, I just wanted to use the idea of Regan and Jack. Regan's married now, and they bought the loft next door. The guy sold it for a good price after they came back from their honeymoon. What they don't know is his estranged wife, who's doing a play in London, comes back right before the blackout that night and calls her husband and said, I know we have to talk. And he said, it's all right, I filed for divorce. She goes, well, if that's the way you want it. He said, yes, that's the way I want it. She goes, well, all right, I'll go to the loft tonight because they have a house in Connecticut. And he said, you can't. And she said, why not? He said, I sold it. She said, what? And he said, oh, it's funny you're not upset about the divorce, but you're upset about me selling the loft. Well, she had put a hidden safe in the loft. And in it, I took an acting class, and the acting teacher said, if you have a problem with someone, write them a letter. You know, it's good therapy. Don't mail it, but get all your grievances out. So she did to everyone in show business who hadn't hired her, and then everyone else, just to make herself feel more confident. And so she's got all the letters in the safe stamped and ready to go. She was never going to mail them, but she knows if her husband, if Regan finds them and gives them to her husband, he'll definitely mail them. So she's got to get back in the loft. And anyway, one thing and another, the night of the blackout, Regan gets involved not in that, but in trying to find a wacky girl who hunts down blonde-haired men and brands them. I mean, not to give away the whole story, but when you start working, I said, I want to use a blackout, I want to use home renovations, and you just get started, and the fun thing is when one thing leads to another when you're writing.
Tell about the name you used.
Oh, well, names also. You think up names, and the girl who's a little crazy in the book, she's wounded from a guy who dumped her in college, and he was really mean about it, and she hasn't gotten over it, and I named him Blaze. And so then by the end of the book, I had to give him a last name. So I had a girl in college, her last name was Darling, so I named him Blaze Darling. And something made me Google this name right before I handed in the book, and my computer almost exploded. It's the hottest porno couple online is Blaze Darling, so I changed his name. But, you know, you have to be so careful, you know, not insult. I mean, you can't get in trouble for something like that because you always end up using names that people have, but I found a name that there's nothing on Google for. Huck Darling is his name now.
And I always try to be careful. I love when I go to a black tie dinner, there are always wonderful names on the seating list, and I never have one name. I'll mix the first and the last name. But a book that I wrote a couple of years ago on the street where you live, it's set in Spring Lake, New Jersey, which is a beautiful Victorian town. And the reason I wrote that book was we were looking for a house, a summer house that would be not too far to get to, because we have one up at Cape Cod, but you have to take longer than a weekend because of the traveling. But I saw this house, and something said, buy it. And I knew that it needed an enormous amount of work. It had been built in 1891. But something said, buy it. And I did. And then at the closing, I knew the lady's name, Mrs. Lembo, who was well up, 90s something, had died, and it was all handled through her son's lawyers. So, but at the closing, when they gave me the deed, her name was Eleanor Higgins Lembo. And I'm Mary Teresa Eleanor Higgins. And I thought, boy, this is something. I loved her house, and then no relation, but we share a great deal of the same name. And then at the Bath and Tennis Club, a few months later, I met her son, and he said, have you found our skeletons in the backyard yet? They had buried a couple of dogs over the years. Well, that triggered, suppose someone who bought the home that had once been in the family, suppose the day she moves in, they're just finishing, they're digging for the pool that the other people had ordered, and she hears someone yell, shut that thing off, there's a body down here. So the house and the fact that her name was Higgins and the skeletons, they triggered the story, and the book bought the house. So it was a lovely round robin. It was a wonderful round robin. But I used scenes from 1890 because there is a backstory in it. And it's wonderful to get old newspapers, the Asbury Park Press from the 1890s, to read it when you read what you read in the newspapers today, and how much, really horrible stuff. And here the news headline in the Asbury Park Press was Miss So-and-so was cantering on her horse when the animal broke into a gallop, and Mr. So-and-so cantering nearby did bravely race and grabbed the reins and saved the young woman, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice if life were like that? And the crime story of the day was that a man went into the grocery store, the greengrocer, and with a check, and the greengrocer knew that his aunt was in Europe. So he called the police, who told the scallywag to get out of town on the quick. Life was simpler then. But I did take names from the old families because, like in Atlanta, generations would be at Cape Cod. And I took some of the old names. And one day when I was in church, a woman stopped me and she said, "Thank you for using my name in your book." I said, "Oh, did I?" She said, "Yes." But she said, "Why did you strangle me on the boardwalk?" I said, "Absolutely nothing personal at all."
And you have to do research for your books because, believe me, you hear from people about everything from a typo, which you work so hard proofreading the pages before they come out with a lot of other sets of eyes. But if you get anything wrong at all, and we've written 4 Christmas books together now, and a few years ago we wrote one called The Christmas Thief, which is about a guy who scammed people out of $80 million. He put the money in uncut diamonds and hid them in a flask in a tree in Vermont. Then he was arrested and has been in prison for 12 years. He gets out, and he breaks parole, heads to Stowe, Vermont with his buddies to get the flask and then be off to Brazil for a great life. Well, when they get to Vermont, they discover that the tree the flask is hidden in has been chosen as the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree and is going to be cut down in the morning. So we thought this was funny. And we combined my character, Regan, with my mother's character, Elvira, who's the cleaning woman who won $40 million in the lottery, who's, by the way, I saved her life when I retyped the book she appeared in, Weep No More, My Lady, was where Elvira first showed up, and I was retyping that book. Elvira had won the money. She went to a spa in California, but she's wearing a hidden microphone in a pin because she's going to do a story for a newspaper. And the killer realizes that Elvira is on to too many things. So when she's went in for a collagen treatment, he slipped in and injected her with a poison. So I'm reading and retyping this book, and I love the character Elvira. And they find her, and she's in a coma, and her husband comes out and is trying to talk her out of it at the hospital. And at the end of the chapter, she died. And I said, "Oh my God," I called my mother. I said, "You can't kill Elvira." She said, "Yes, I can." I said, "You killed enough people in this book, please." And so she left her hanging by a thread. But then she ended up using her in short stories. And when we were asked to write a Christmas book together, we said, we'll have Elvira and my character, Regan, solve crimes together. So they're up in Vermont when these guys come up and get involved in the story. But as far as the research goes, my mother and I went up to Stowe in August just to look around, and there was a Christmas tree farm, and we pulled in the driveway. We thought the gift shop was open, but it didn't open till the fall. But there were 3 generations of women on the porch there, one 88-year-old, her daughter, and her granddaughter. And we had been told by a man who's in the tree business that it would take these guys 3 hours to cut down that tree in the middle of the night without an electric saw, because they'd want to try and do it quietly, of course. So we were just talking, and they said we were going to have the diamonds in a pouch at the base of the tree, and they said, no, if you cut the tree, it would rot and die, so they suggested the flask. And then I said to the oldest woman, I said, and she'd had this business for 50 years, I said, how long would it take to cut down one of these trees? And she looked at me and she said, I could do it in about 10 minutes. And here we'd been plotting that the criminals, the big tough guys, would be taking 3 hours to cut down the tree, and we would have looked like jerks if that had...
Someone had told us that. And the other thing she said is, don't put the jewels in a cloth pouch because it will rot. And she said, don't put it in the trunk because it will kill the tree. And we had gotten a lot of misinformation on that. So she said what you do is you put it in a steel container like a thermos bottle and strap it to the outside of the branch. So these are the things you want to be accurate, because people will get after you, and you try desperately hard. In fact, I received a letter from one of the nuns who had taught me when I was in Villa Maria, and she wrote, "Dear Mary," all those years ago. She wrote, "Dear Mary, we are also delighted for your success. However, you clearly did not listen when Mother St. Margaret of the Angels explained the difference between to lay and to lie." And she did the whole thing, lay, laying, to lay, go. She did the whole thing. She said, "I am now teaching Native Americans in New Mexico, the teenage boys who delight to write." She laid him on the floor. "Oh dear, sincerely yours in Christ, Sister Louise." Another guy says, "Come, Mrs. Clark, you don't know the difference between bring and take." And I hear from him, or did hear from him regularly. And I finally said to the copy editor, "For the love of God, will you please put bring and take on a billboard? I don't want to hear one more letter from this guy."
You bring something with you, you take
it away.
You
But somehow I seem to have it. I don't think I do it anymore. But then you got a letter.
Oh yeah, after my third book came out, I got a letter. Now you get the emails, but I got a letter. It said, "Dear Carol Higgins Clark, I bought your book, I enjoyed it, and gave it to my friends so they wouldn't have to spend money on it." I'm like, "Oh, thanks." And we're always glad when people share books. It's just the way he put this. The main reason I bought it was to see if you could overcome a shortcoming of your mama. Well, you can't. She doesn't know the difference between bring and take, and neither do you. So it was kind of funny, but
things like that you don't mind, but you hate yourself if you make any serious mistake. And I've had a pair of retired detectives whom I use if the book is set in New York and I want to use the kind of legal background that you need to have. And in this one, Where Are You Now? That one, 2 years ago, I read an article in the New York Times about a woman who's pushing 80 now. 35 years ago, which makes it 37 years now, her 21-year-old son walked out of his college dorm and has not been seen or heard from since. The father and mother were teachers. I mean, it was just an average, well-educated, seemingly happy family of 3 young adults. And he calls a couple of times a year and breathes into the phone. She knows it is he. The father ended up drinking because of the anxiety. He started drinking heavily. The brother went into depression, and the sister moved away because she said, "I can't live in this climate any longer. I have to get away from it." The mother still hopes that someday he'll walk in the door. Well, I didn't write about that, but I take the DNA of a story like that. And I thought, suppose a 21-year-old walked out of his Columbia College dorm. Suppose he calls only on Mother's Day. Says, "Mom, I'm fine. Fine. Bye." And when this last one, as the book opens, his mother is saying, "Mac, for God's sake, come and see me. Let me talk to you. If you're in trouble, I'll help you." And his sister, who is now 26 and a lawyer, and she loved her big brother, but now she's angry and resentful at all these years of anxiety, and she gets on the phone and says, "Mac, you lowlife, I will find you." The next day she goes to the police, and it turns out that they decide he may be the serial killer they have been looking for 10 years. So I only took the backbone of the other story, and then I go completely and totally into fiction. But I've been doing it right since the first Where Are the Children? Because that actually wasn't my first book. My first one was a biographical novel about George Washington. Because at that time I was writing radio scripts for a living, and I was writing a series called Portrait of a Patriot, 4-minute program syndicated to 500 stations, and they would go like this. At age 14, she was given the family tree and said, "But I am nearer to the throne than I realized. Do you know who she is? Da, 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 da. This is Portrait of a Patriot. Da, 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 da." And halfway through, have you guessed who she is yet? No? Well, here are more clues. And then at the end, our patriot today, Victoria Regina, Queen of England, Empress of India. Tune in tomorrow. Well, you did the presidents, you did the first ladies, you did the scientists, you did, and I wrote the show for 3 years. But one guy I had been ducking was George Washington, because he always seemed to be dull. You know, you just felt, I cannot tell a lie. He had his photographs was so stiff. I heard he married an older woman for her money. And so there was nothing. And finally I thought, well, I obviously can't skip the first president. And when I started researching him, I said, wait a minute, who is this man? At 26, he was the hero of the French and Indian War. He was the best dancer in the colony of Virginia. Yes, Martha was older, 8 months older. She was 27 and he was 26 when they married. She was never called Martha. She was called Patsy. He called her my dearest Patsy. He courted her at her estate, which was called the White House. She went through the British lines to join him in Boston, and she spent that awful winter at Valley Forge with him there. And I thought, I want to write about this. There is a love story here that is wonderful. So my agent had been frantic for me to write a book, because there was no market for short stories, and I sold reasonably well with short stories, but there was no market. The women's magazines all went to nonfiction. And I met her on Park Avenue once, and I hadn't given her anything for a couple of years. She said, write a book. I said, I'm writing a book, Pat. She said, what about? I said, George Washington. And her face got kind of mean. And, you know, her eyes slanted. And she said, why? And I gushed about this wonderful romance between the two, George and Martha. And she interrupted me, and she said, love story between those two? Listen, Mary, the only thing George ever gave Martha was splinters. With the wooden teeth. Yeah. Well, I wrote it anyhow. It sold for $1,500 for 3 years' work. I called it Aspire to the Heavens, which was his mother's family motto. And the few bookstores that got into it was next to the Bible, because everyone thought it was a spiritual book. And I remember once we left work, and 3 or 4 of us would have lunch together if we didn't have when I was doing the radio shows, if we didn't have a business lunch. And we passed a bookstore on Madison Avenue, and there was Aspire to the Heavens in the window. And I said, right up front. We came back from lunch and passed the store, and the book was gone. I said, snapped up. The same little group passed the bookstore at 5 o'clock, and there was a copy of Aspire to the Heavens in the window. And one of the guys said, whoever bought it returned it.
Well, the final thing about that is years later when she became successful as a suspense writer. I mean, I was in 7th grade when that book came out, and we realized we all didn't have our own copies, and so and there were only 1,700 in print originally, so she called a book tracing service and said, you know, if you can find this book anywhere and whatever. She got a call a month later. She went down. A book that had been originally $2.95, she had to pay $100 for a copy, and she opened it up and screamed. It was the autographed copy she'd given to her boss, who had obviously given it away at
To Clarence, Alona, and Claranne, hope you enjoy the fruits of my moonlighting. Love, Mary.
So...
Well, you know, we're talking about us writing books together. People say, well, tell us about the fight. There is no fight. We are there to write a book that will be humorous, will be entertaining, will be a good story. And we sit side by side. Carol's on the computer.
Yeah. I have a laptop, and we usually do it during the summer at her house on Cape Cod or Spring Lake, and just do every word together. And people can't believe we can get along while we're doing it, but we really do. We have a good time with it.
Yeah, we get the overall. For instance, the last one, we said we've done 3 that ended on Christmas Eve, so let's do one that is the week after Christmas, you know, still the season, when some people go on cruises. So, okay, we'll put it on a cruise, and it's got to be a funny cruise. Why is it a funny cruise? Because the guy has one ship, and he's refurbished it with every nickel he has, and he can't get anyone to get on it. So everybody is an invite. And then we say, well, there should be some stowaways. There should be this. And, you know, and then we start laughing. And one time we were laughing so hard, my husband was at the foot of the stairs. My office is on the top floor. And he yelled up, I hope the reading public finds this book as funny as you two do.
But we went on a cruise ourselves for a week just to get away, to be on a ship, to be reminded of what it's like to be on a ship. And we also, this was a big ship, there was a rock climbing wall that we used in the book, and the Peekaboo Bridge where you can watch the captain and that kind of thing. But the first day we got on the ship, it was enormous, and it was usually big groups of people, a lot of families and that kind of thing. So we're just wandering around by ourselves. And we got off the elevator on one floor and saw the captain standing by a staircase. And so we went over and introduced ourselves and said, oh, and we're going to write a mystery on a cruise ship. And he could have cared less, you know, so he's like, oh, that's nice. And then the elevator door opened and a woman spotted my mother, and she got a big smile. She came running over and she said, oh, excuse me, could I get a picture, please? And my mother said, oh, sure. And she started posing. And the woman said, could you get out of the way, please? I want to get a picture with the captain. So we said, let's just go up to our room and write the book. You know, we just went out. Oh, it's time. We've got to take questions. Yes.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
Right. Quick thing we will say is the last thing before we take questions. Neither one of us uses either sex or violence in the books. And I have said I always say, if I'm asked about it, the sexiest lines written in the 20th century were, you'll not shut me out of your bedroom tonight, my dear.
And where was that book? What book is that?
There we go.
Okay, so who would like to ask a question? Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Mary, I have heard Harlan Coben speak of you on a number of occasions, and one of the things he said was that Where Are the Children is the best example of pacing of any book he has ever seen, and he recommended it everywhere. And I wonder, is that something that or was it just
Could you all hear that question? Harlan Coben, who's a dear friend, has been complimentary about the pacing in Where Are the Children. Well, the whole book took place in 14 hours. And you see, I believe when it's possible in the containment of time. Because if you know that the bomb is ticking, in this one you know that the children are going to be thrown into the bay at high tide, which is 7 o'clock or whatever it is. And the whole book takes place in that time. So by the containment of time, you as the reader are building up, I hope, the anxiety of look for them there, don't you see? And it's always wonderful when you can have characters who don't know what they know. They in that case, the friend had seen the mitten when she showed the house where the children were being kept. And she put it in her pocket and said, I won't tell Nancy that the baby must have kicked it out of the car when I had them at the store the other day, not knowing that's where the mitten means the baby, the 3-year-old is there. So thanks, Harlan. But I agree, not certainly that, I certainly agree that Where Are the Children's a pretty good book. But I agree that pacing for anyone's book is a vital element in suspense.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, you might want to come up to the mic so everybody can hear the question.
There's a lady right there. Okay.
Love both your books.
Thank you.
But Carol, how did you come up with just the one-word titles?
Okay. My first book was about a murderer on a cruise ship, and we were throwing around titles, and my mother came up with the title Decked, and we liked it and named it Decked, and then it just so happened that the next book I was writing was about a murderer at a pantyhose convention, because a friend of mine had a pantyhose business, and I went with him to a convention, and so I said, if that was Decked, this should be Snagged. So that was my one-word titles by accident. And my latest one, Zapped, I actually had some woman accusing me of stealing her title. I mean, it was crazy. But she self-published a book named Zapped in 2002 that I didn't know about. But anyway, that's where I got started with it. And it's fun because when people suggest titles, I can't repeat to you. You know, everybody thinks they're being funny, but it's great because it identifies my books. And titles are very hard. You want something that will grab your readers, and if people know my books, then they know, you know, when they see the book that it's mine or hear the title. So, and just like my mother now uses song titles or lyrics from song, like "Where Are You Now" is the line. Is that the title of the song or is that in the
No,
song?
it comes from the Kashmir song, and nobody seems to have heard it except me.
I heard it in the airport. I was getting something in. I heard someone,
Because I saw one of the old black and white movies, and I was half asleep, and I thought they're playing the Kashmir song, and it went like this: "Pale hands I love beside the Shalimar, where are you now? Who lies beneath your spell?" And I thought that's perfect for this book. Actually, because it's about a missing person, I was going to call it "Whither Do You Wander?" And the sales force at Simon & Schuster sent back word that a lot of people didn't know what "whither" meant. I think "Where Are You Now" is better. "Whither Do You Wander" might have been too base.
Good evening. I'm a reading teacher by trade, and I'm here for the International Reading Association Convention. We love children's books. Are you planning on another children's book? This one I just picked up this evening. But
Oh, thank you so much.
We love it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I did my first children's book with the illustrator, and the illustrator, Wendell Miner, is simply brilliant. I mean, and he does covers as well. Over the years, he's done 4 of my covers, including "Where Are the Children?" which is kind of a Gothic house and the red mitten on the lawn. He's wonderful. And we were at a cocktail party 2 years ago, and his editor was there and my editor. And we were joking about it because my friend who's sophisticated, this is 34 years ago, she said, "Mary, now that you have a book coming out, what you have to do, the chic thing to do is to buy the cover, the artwork." So I called him and I bought it. I think it was $1,000. And he said, "I will have it framed for you properly." But he said, "You must understand that I would have to have the right to borrow it back if I'm having an exhibition. And underneath it, I will have a plaque that says, 'From the collection of Mary Higgins Clark.'" I said, "That's fun, except take out 'from.' This is the collection of Mary Higgins Clark." Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Do you want to come up to the mic?
Yes,
or-
come
okay.
on, right, a couple of people. Yeah. Oh, yes, come up
there's
and be
somebody
right
coming.
behind, sure.
I just have one comment about Where Are the Children. It was the first of your books that I had read, of course. But I got started and I had to put it down. I could not finish it for several weeks. I had 2 daughters that were just a little bit older than the children in your book. It was so intense and so real to me that I just could not read it.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. That's a compliment. That's a compliment.
And all of your books have been gripping in different ways, but that one was what sold me on your writing.
Oh, thank you so much.
She had asked the same question. I was wondering too about a children's book, but your new one is very gripping too. And as a mother, I can relate to a lot of that.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. Always remember, we appreciate you very much. Without readers, I have news. The publisher is not interested in the writer. So it's very much of a two-way street, the writer to the reader and the reader to the writer.
I like the Mike and Sunday book and stories. Are you planning to do any more Sunday stories?
Sunday? Yeah, I had so much fun writing Sunday, and I just have gotten away from her without meaning to, you know. But Sunday, Our Gal Sunday was a radio show I listened to as a kid. I had asthma so much that I was home and between a stack of books on the bed, because in the morning I could start to breathe. At night I'm like this. But there were a couple of radio shows in those days I loved. And this one was a 15-minute soap opera, as they called them in those days. And it started like this. Our Gal Sunday, the story that asked the question, can a little girl from a mining town in the West find happiness as the wife of England's richest, most handsome lord, Lord Henry Brinthorpe? And I thought, who couldn't? I could. When I was 10 years old, I thought that. So when I had to write a short story, I did a takeoff, except he's the president, ex-president. He was elected at 35 and is out at 43. And he marries the young congresswoman. And he's the richest guy, you know, and the handsomest, a real Lord Henry. I call him Henry Parker Britain IV. And he married a young congresswoman whose father is a motorman. So I just did a spoof of that, and I did a collection. It's called My Gal Sunday, I think. But, yeah, I will do more, because I glanced through that, and I thought, gee, I like Henry and Sunday. I've got to bring them back. There's another thing that breaks my heart, though. In one of those stories, they go abroad, and they don't want the security, so they go disguised. And Henry goes as Harry Potter. If I'd only made him a wizard at that point.
Yeah, this was before Howard. That was before Harry Potter was written.
Thank you. Question?
Did you hear that?
Yes. The question was, well, I'll just answer that. I am truly an eclectic reader. I honestly am, because from the time I was little, I was holding, my mother would call, is the light out? Yes, it was out, but if I held a book like this, I could get it from the street light. Writers are eclectic. I mean, I always loved history. If George Washington had been successful, I would have been an historical writer, because I love history. David McCullough, for example, is a good friend. My God. Doris Kearns Goodwin. I mean, her writing, the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, her books. I love suspense. Other books, I think The Kite Runner and 100,000 Suns or Moons, whichever it is, wonderful. The Memory Keeper's Daughter. And then I like to reread the classics, because you always find something, layers that you never saw when you were young. What about you, Carol?
Oh, well, same type of thing. Read what's current, what's going on. We're in a writers group that meets the first Tuesday night of every month for dinner. We have a room at an Italian restaurant upstairs, and Harlan Coben is in that, and Susan Isaacs, Linda Fairstein, Lawrence Block. And we just talk about writing and what you're working on. And so we always usually read each other's books, but it's just all over the place. You'd like to read other mystery writers to see how they do it or what they're doing. So that's always interesting.
I've got to tell you a quick story about our writers group, because here we are, all professional writers, and we just want to talk about the craft of writing. What are you writing? What are you up to? You know, just, it's fun. But one night, one of the guys said, I'm going to give you a scenario. You all have to promise that you will, from the top of your head, answer the question. Promise. Picture this. You're alone in a large house. It is in an isolated area. It is 4 in the morning and pitch black. The house is securely locked, and the alarm system is on. The scariest sound, a scream, shattering glass, a bullet. We went around. And he said, no, you're all wrong. You're alone, large house, remote area, pitch black, house locked, alarm system on, and the toilet flushes. That's scary. And it's true, when the usual becomes unusual, that's when it's suddenly frightening. Things change. But anyhow, I
well,
thought
that's what I loved about the movie Misery. Did you see that with Kathy Bates? And when she went out and came back, and when she just looked at the table where all the little things were that she had, and she realized that one of them was out of place. Because remember, he'd gotten out of bed and tried to escape, and just that was the scariest thing, to see her expression when she just noticed that something wasn't right. And is that when she took the hammer and hit it? I can't remember, whatever it was. And,
that was scary. Yes?
Other questions?
What is your next book that you're working on?
The
question is, what is the next book?
Well, I just saw an article, and I don't think I will tell you, but I think it's such a good idea. Because I looked at an article in the newspaper, and I said, wait a minute, my God, that's perfect. And it's still too young, but it's a good idea.
Not the one from today, right?
What?
Not the one from today.
No, there's another one.
Well, we were on the plane today.
That should be yours.
No, I think it would be better. We saw it, I don't know whether you saw it today, The Woman Who Can Remember Every Day of Her Life. Did you see this? We saw it in USA Today. There was a big story. And they have had scientists give a date, and she can remember I mean, something big is like when Elvis died and that kind of thing, but she can remember everything that happened after she was 8 or 9 as a child. But she's very unhappy and miserable. And but they found out that other people, they're doing studies, there are a few other people that have this. I mean, can you imagine remembering every day of your life? If you said June 5th, 1970, she can tell you. Well, I don't know how old she is. She's, I think, maybe in her 40s or so. But she can, and my mother said, that would be good for you. I said, I think it's better for you. We were going back and forth saying who it would be better for, because I use comedy, you can't make fun of somebody like that. She's tortured in her life. But because my mother uses the more psychological suspense, I think you should, just that idea of someone who every day she's remembering everything that happened in her life, every detail.
Yeah, well, and the thing about it is that you remember so vividly, something that was hers. If someone died in the family, she still lives through the emotions. And that's a horrible burden to have. But you could take a piece of that story and use it. But the one that I picked out, because it was just 3 weeks ago and I was going to sign, and the car was waiting outside, and my husband is on time always, which is a wonderful trait. I admire
Not
it.
one they share.
Not one we share. And he said, the car's outside. I really did have enough time. And I said, wait a minute. He said, you read that when you come home, I said, you don't get it. This is my next book we're looking at. And I tore the paper out. I just feel it's a little too soon to talk it, because it's almost like a little something that's just starting to bubble. And if I talk it, I might smash it. But I really think I have this. And oddly enough, the subject is something that I started to write about as a novella and put it down because I thought, I'm not ready then. That's not right for me right now. So I started on the same subject. But when I read this, I figured out, this is the way I would tell that story. So, that's what's exciting. I can't wait to get at it now. Now I'm ready to get back, and sit down with those empty pages and start again.
How long does it take you from starting an idea to you finish?
Well, we each have a contract to do a book a year. By the end of December, that they want that book in. In fact, they start torturing me in early December. They call up, how you doing? Blah, 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 blah. Fine. But they need it because they come out in April. And of course, it's the cover and it's the physical stuff. It's the copy editing. It's going through I read what do they call them now, page proofs, 3 times to find, is there an error? Is there a better word? Is there something? I don't like the way that looks. And that takes time. The hardest part of it all is reading those page proofs, line by line, word by word. And there's one typo in this book. It's not
Don't
a big
tell
one.
where it is. I don't know.
But-
Do you have a typo in the book?
And somebody wrote me. I thought you'd want to know, but there is a typo in it. So you'd rather not. Or, in this case, the third go-round, I thought there's something wrong. And then I started figuring, I said, this book ends on Thursday morning, not Wednesday morning. Because I'm going from one character to another, and something happens at 3 in the morning, which, of course, is early one morning, but you might say that night when she went out. And I realized I was making a mistake. I corrected it. But that, to me, is the hardest, because you have all those pages of manuscript and going through them and then making sure that they put all the changes in and then insisting on seeing them one more time. But then it's time to start the new book. A happy problem, very happy problem.
We have time for one more question. There.
Several of your books have been made into movies. I sort of remember Still Watches being one of the ones that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Which other ones have been made into movies, and how did you feel about the production of the movie? Were you happy with the way it was developed and produced?
Well, I agree. Still Watch was good. Linda Carter and Angie Dickinson were in that, and that was a very good one. And they're in varying degrees. People have told me that they've enjoyed them a lot. But the darn trouble is that the budgets are fairly low for these, and it shows a bit. But on the other hand, it's fun to see them be made. I've never gotten the big full-screen one where everybody got popcorn and waited online, you know, to get in. And I've been told I'm not sexy enough or violent enough for the big screen. And I said to one young guy, who looked about 22, he was with one of the major agencies in Hollywood, and I said to him, if only Alfred Hitchcock were alive today. And he looked at me and looked thoughtfully, he said, you know, today he wouldn't make it. I said, if Alfred Hitchcock wouldn't make it, then there's no hope for me.
I just have to say, in Where Are the Children, they made a feature film, and my mother usually does her little walk-on, and I had played a reporter. There were a lot of courthouse scenes, and I had been in a group of reporters, and then I was standing on the side. My mother was in a different scene with a group of reporters, so the director gathered them together and said, all right, she's going to come out. Jill Clayburgh was starring in it, and she killed her kids, and I want you all to be vultures. Just go after her. So I saw my mother getting all prepared, and so they said, action. So my mother went charging up and said, come on, Jill. Did you kill your kids or what? Come on, Jill. They're like, cut. Who's calling her Jill? The author who named her Nancy. So anyway.
My big line, my Hollywood walk.
I think we're
yes, I
finished
think
now.
they're ready.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us. We enjoyed it so much.